Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first part of Success and Intro to Psychology. My name is Dr. Ryan Curtis, and I am going to be your host for these interactive videos, which are tied to the OpenPsych website, which is a alternative free textbook to introductory psychology. These will go in order of the modules, which I will call chapters in OpenPsych, starting with the first module, which I'll call a chapter, Chapter 1, Success in Intro to Psychology. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Scott Roberts and Dr. Dylan Selterman, who have been working tirelessly to keep OpenPsych going and have contributed in a lot of different things. In fact, many of the slides that I'm using are stolen from Dr. Scott Roberts. That'll be throughout this entire class. So thank you to both of them for all of their help and guidance. So we need to talk about psychology, and to give you an idea of how these are going to go, let me first talk about learning objectives. Learning objectives are the goals that I have for what you should be learning in this class. Now, on the OpenPsych website, you will see that under every chapter, there's going to be certain questions in each section. When you look at those questions, those are the learning objectives. Those are the things that you should learn while you're reading through the resource. In this particular video that we're talking about today, I want you to be able to define affect, behavior, and cognition, how they're part of the definition of psychology. That's coming up. And be able to distinguish between the following theories: biosocial, which is the same as evolutionary theory, the sociocultural theory, the learning theory, and the social cognitive theory. As we go through these, you'll see certain questions come up that'll stop the video. You take the question, and we will move on from there. So let's begin with the definition of psychology. Many of you have perhaps been in a psychology class before, but defining psychology is sometimes difficult to do. We're going to define psychology as the science of understanding affect, behavior, and cognition. Now, the word affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, that's not affect. It's not the verb affect. It's a noun, affect. When you look at this definition, there should be several things that pop up for you. The first is the second word, which is science. Psychology is a science. How on earth can we be so bold as to say that psychology is a science? Don't we all know that the social sciences are soft sciences and they just call themselves well, we are a science because we use the scientific method to understand affect, behavior, and cognition. We are a science because that's what we're going to do. We'll talk later on about how we do our research methods and why we are a science. But the first part of this is that we are a science. Psychology is a science. The science of understanding these three things: ABC, affect, behavior, and cognition. Let's go through these. Affect means feeling states. So when you talk about your feelings, you're talking about affect. So most common forms of affect are things like emotions or moods. These are forms of affect. They're feeling states. Behavior is exactly what you think it is. A behavior is a behavior. And cognition is how we process information. So often when you think about cognitions, you think about thoughts, right? Thoughts are a form of cognition, but cognition is involved in other things as well: memory, decision-making, and many other things that we'll talk about later on in the course. So psychology is the science of understanding our feelings, our behaviors, and how we process information: affect, behavior, and cognition. So I want to ask you a question then. Psychology is the same as which of these? The answer is none of these. Psychology is similar to all of these, but it's not the same. And let's go through a few reasons why. So we'll go through each one of these individually. And there's many other examples of crossover and things that are similar between psychology and other disciplines. Don't get me wrong. But psychology is different from sociology. Now, sociology is generally the study of groups of people, like societies, but also cultures. They can be smaller groups. That's not only like an entire country all the time, but it's looking how groups interact with each other. And it might involve their their feelings, as their behaviors and their thoughts. Could be all of those things. But sociology is different from psychology in that psychology tends to focus on what's being processed by an individual. So an individual's affect, behavior, cognition. Now, it might be influenced by groups, don't get me wrong, but we're not looking at the whole group's affect, behavior, cognition. We're looking at the individual on the individual level. That's the main difference between psychology and sociology. Anthropology generally is looking at whole cultures in less of a scientific way, meaning they're not necessarily applying the scientific method. They tend to be using a more humanistic, a humanities form of looking at things and understanding, analyzing in a much more qualitative kind of a way instead of a quantitative, science-based way that we normally do in psychology. Political science is similar in that respect as well. When they say science, they're not always talking about running experiments kind of science. Whereas in psychology, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about running experiments and understanding things through the scientific method very directly. Now, there's other forms of disciplines that involve psychology. For example, things like criminology or maybe even marketing and business. Many of those disciplines use psychology and psychological findings but in a more specific vein. So for example, criminology, you care more about the psychology of how we interact with the justice system, criminal justice, and criminal behavior. Whereas business marketing is about persuading people to buy or to be influenced in a business kind of a form. Psychology is broader than that. We tend to look at the thoughts and feelings and behaviors of any of those things. So yeah, it could be about antisocial behavior like in criminology. Yeah, it could be about business behavior and persuading people to buy things. Yeah, absolutely. But psychology is the broader science of understanding affect, behavior, and cognition. So what we're going to do is we're now going to talk about Uggs. Now, in case you don't know what I'm talking about these boots called Uggs. And I'm going to ask you a few questions right now. I want to know your opinion. There's not right or wrong answers for these questions. I want to know what you think. So first, answer this question. Do you consider yourself male, female, or other? Okay. Now I want you to answer this question. Are Uggs still in fashion? All right. Now, when I say Uggs, I don't mean just Uggs. I mean like Uggs or, their Ugg-like brother and what, things that look like Uggs and people would recognize Uggs. They don't have to say UGG Ugg in order for this to happen. So the reason why I split that, I ask you those questions is to understand a few things. Just so you know, here's some recent data that we've gotten. This is becoming more 50-50 than it used to be, but still there's a decent proportion who still think that Uggs are still in fashion, which I'm kind of surprised at, frankly. All right. Tell me, do you own a pair of Uggs or fake Uggs? All right, so what we're going to do now is look at this. Now, this is a breakdown of past data that I've received from previous students. And we split this just male and female. So if you don't identify as male and female, I apologize, but generally there's only a small proportion who don't identify as male and female, and I felt like it wouldn't be ethical to put their data up in front of other people. So that's why I'm only showing male and female here. So what you'll see is that there's a slight difference in the way people answer this question. For example, females are a little more likely to agree that Uggs are still in fashion, at least based off of these data. And you'll see this is a distinct difference. Now, these are all from the United States, right? So I'm not claiming that this is like a global understanding, but within just in my class, when I've asked this question, this is the breakdown that I tend to get. Whether or not you own a pair of Uggs tends to be very different based off of whether you identify as male or female. Now, why might that be? So first of all, I want you to think about this. Is this idea of Uggs, whether you own an Uggs or not, are these questions that are involved in psychology, the understanding of affect, behavior, or cognition? The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. Affect has to do with your feeling state. So if you love Uggs, if you have a happy feeling when you see your Uggs, that's an affect. Behavior is putting the Uggs on, wearing them, or buying them. For example, going out and purchasing them so that you can say that you own them. Cognitions include other things like beliefs. So for example, the question, Uggs are still in fashion? That has to do with your beliefs, whether or not you believe Uggs to be in fashion or not to be in fashion anymore. Now, whether you love them or hate them, that's actually a separate issue, but your belief about them is a form of cognition. So even things as simple as your opinions about Uggs, that's psychology. That's absolutely psychology. And in psychology, we tend to understand things based off of a lot of different frameworks, but today we're going to talk about four theoretical perspectives, four theoretical frameworks for understanding basically any aspect of psychology. Now, I want to make sure that this is clear that I'm not saying that these are the only theoretical frameworks, and I'm also saying that these have to be mutually exclusive. That is, somebody can really adhere to one of these perspectives and to another depending on the data that's going on. But these are ways of understanding. Specifically, we're going to think about behaviors in this case. Why people do what they do according to these four different perspectives. Now, these are pretty broad perspectives. And so what I want you to understand is how each one of these perspectives would encounter a behavior such as whether or not you wear Uggs. All right? So let's start with the first, which is the biosocial theory. All right? The biosocial theory, sometimes called the sociobiological, most commonly probably called the evolutionary theory, is a theoretical perspective that people use to understand psychology. This, and we're going to go through the basics of some basic evolutionary principles, just so you know. This is a way that many scientists understand why people do what they do, why people think what they think or feel what they feel. So let's kind of go through some basics of evolutionary psychology. So the idea is that, hey, there's a lot of genetic chaos that's going on. So if you look here, you see we've got those puppies, right? And even though the puppies have the same mommy and daddy, that is, they come from the same genetic pool, they have variations in their genetics, right? In the same way that these three sisters right here have differences in their genetic makeup, even though they come from the same mother and father. So specifically, when sometimes we have even more specific changes called mutations that happen in your genetics, right? So one dog might have a specific extra ability to smell, right? And others might not. Thoughts and behaviors, according to this theory, can be inherited, just like your sense of smell or the number of spots you have or the number of freckles can be inherited. Well, your thoughts and behaviors can also be inherited. There's a lot. I'm not saying that every thought and every behavior is only inherited. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a lot of inherited traits that happen when we look in psychology, when we talk about things like opinions, but even stuff like mental health issues, such as mental illness, etc., do have heritable traits. And so these things can be passed on. Well, life is hard, as a species, and resources are limited. Resources, meaning things that help you survive, are limited, and therefore the fittest are going to be able to survive and reproduce. And that means that certain mutations are going to be more fit than others, particularly if, for example, if you're a doggy that has extra sense of smell, then you are more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. So this is kind of important. We're going to break this down, introductory level stuff here. We're going to say that there are two basic motives why anybody does anything according to evolutionary theory. There's two reasons why anybody does anything in evolution, and they are to survive and reproduce. So people do things in order to survive individually or pass on their genes, right? Like GE and like genetic genes, not Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants genes. We're talking about their genetic genes. So much of what exists is adaptive, or was at least at one point, and therefore it got passed down. Let's talk about some examples. Reese's peanut butter cups. Why do people eat Reese's peanut butter cups according to the evolutionary theory? Now, when you think about this, you got to say, hey, it either helped them survive or reproduce. So according to the evolutionary theory, you might say that people crave fatty, sugary foods because they offered more energy at a time when those things were very scarce. And therefore, the ones who craved sugary and fatty foods were more likely to get the resources, in this case, the energy they needed to survive, and therefore they were able to reproduce, and that trait passed on, etc., etc., etc. So, why do people crave Reese's? Because at one point, it helped humans survive and therefore reproduce. The second theoretical perspective that we need to talk about is called the learning theory. Now, students get confused with this all the time. Learning is not the same as education. So if you go and you want to take a learning class in psychology, they're not going to teach you about educational techniques. That's not what it's going to be about. Instead, it's going to be about something in psychology called behaviorism. Behaviorism was a theoretical perspective that was really dominant in the mid 20th century, and it has to do with the idea that people, okay, there's very extreme behaviorists, and they're talking about just the behaviors. Okay, so they're focusing not on thoughts and not on feelings, only on behaviors. And their idea was that organisms are designed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Make sense? Okay, so your basic drive, seek pleasure, avoid pain. I think that makes sense, right? So pleasure, by pleasure I mean biological or psychological needs. We're talking about pleasure when you eat some food or when you have a drink of water. This would include things like sexual pleasure as well. But we're talking about basic kinds of pleasure here. Basic. And by pain, I mean something very detrimental, like ouch, got burned, pain. That's what we're talking about. So, according to the behaviorists, you are going to do things because you are seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. So, for example, this kid right here, the behaviorists would say, hey, if the kid touched the hot stove, then that kid would experience pain. They wouldn't do that behavior again. The behaviorists focus on just the behaviors, like touching the hot stove. Okay? Now, the behavior is determined by the experience with an outcome. That means that when the kid touches the stove, the outcome was pain, not going to do that again. Simple. The behavior is let's go and I don't know, let's go and learn something about psychology. That brings you some pleasure. You do that again. All right, fine. What you see here is something called a Skinner box. B.F. Skinner is one of the most famous of the behaviorist psychologists. And he did a lot of work, instead of with humans, with mice, pigeons, and other animals. So rats, right? And this is called a Skinner box. So I don't know if you've seen the movie, the Pixar movie Ratatouille. You remember what the name of the bad guy chef was in Ratatouille? It was Chef Skinner, because he put rats in a box and made them do things. So that was an homage to B.F. Skinner. And so what Skinner would do is he'd say, hey, Skinner was a pretty strict behaviorist, and he thought, you know what, this is not about the rat planning ahead of what's going to provide a lot of pleasure or a lot of pain. That's not what's going on here. Instead, what's happening is the rat, or any organism, just kind of acts randomly. And if they get pleasure from it, they do it again. If they get pain, they don't do it again. So the Skinner box is set up so that you can see it's got little lights here, right? So what you can do is you can train, it's got a little microphone, and this bar right here can allow food to come down. This, on the other hand, the floor is wired so that it can deliver electric shocks. So pleasure, food, pain, electric shocks. And you can actually make rats or other animals do very complicated behaviors, like spin around 3 times and do a backflip. Okay? Now, it's not, according to the learning theory, it's not because they're saying, hey, you know what, I think it would be really fulfilling if I spun around 3 times and did a backflip. No. That's not what's going on. Instead, all they're doing is, if they receive pleasure from doing something, they do it again. If they receive pain, they didn't do it again. So to get the complex behavior, the rat randomly spins around and suddenly some food comes out. Does it again, food comes out. Does it twice, food comes out. 3 times, food comes out. And then just acting randomly is given pleasure or pain. In fact, strict behaviorists actually believed that we don't really think. I know. But they're saying it's really just all about the behavior. We're not really planning things out. We're just reacting to things that have given us pleasure or pain in the past. It is true, though, and over time we've learned that some species don't have to actually experience the pleasure or the pain. They can actually observe other species doing it. Now, so this would not be a strict learning approach. What I'm saying here is that just learning is kind of fallen out of favor, but learning is very effective. Meaning, learning theory is you receive pleasure, you do it again. You receive pain, you don't do it again. That's it. Not planning ahead, just pleasure or pain. That's it. Okay, now we've talked about two of these. Let's talk about UGs. Let's talk about the distinction between these two theories when we're talking about UGs. So I want you to think to yourself, why would anyone wear UGs according to, let's go back, the evolutionary theory? According to this biosocial, which is the evolutionary theory, why would they wear UGs? The only reason why they would wear UGs is to survive or reproduce. So for example, in this case, they might say, hey, if I wear UGs, I won't get frostbite. And if I have frostbite, I'm more likely to die. So I wear UGs because I have an inherited trait that I want to survive, and keeping my feet warm is going to help me survive. That would be an evolutionary approach. That's very different from the learning theory approach, which says, why am I wearing UGs? Well, what I would have to do is basically just act randomly, just walking around. Oh, I accidentally stepped in an UGG. Oh, I find that pleasurable. And then you do it again. Okay, do you see the difference? One is a distinct intent to survive or reproduce, right? And that's very different than acting randomly and then having pleasure or pain come from it. So the first two theories that we've talked about, the general theoretical perspectives, are the evolutionary theory, which is called the biosocial theory, and the learning theory, which is also called behaviorism. The sociocultural theory is the third theory, and this is very basic. The sociocultural theory says that there are certain group norms that guide our thoughts and behaviors. Now, what is a norm? A norm is what is normal in your culture. It's not necessarily like a law where you're going to get arrested if you don't do it, but it's a norm, something that you determines what should or shouldn't happen in a given perspective, in a given situation. So, for example, bowing versus shaking hands, those are norms. All right, in certain societies, you bow when you greet other people. In other societies, you shake their hands. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to bow or wrong to shake hands, but a certain norm will guide what you're supposed to do. Now, these norms, though, can be pretty widespread, and they can influence us quite a bit. For example, in what is true versus false, in what is right versus wrong, in what makes something attractive versus repulsive, masculine or feminine. So, for example, when you look at these different pictures, these are photos of, in this case, women from many different cultures. So, what is influencing their behavior for how they dress or what is appearing attractive? Well, it depends on the norms, and you'll see that these norms are quite different one from another. So when you're thinking about the UGGs, why would people wear UGGs according to sociocultural theory? They do it because that's what everybody else is doing, because that's the norm, because that's kind of what people do. Now, we saw that there's quite a bit of a difference. When we often think of cultures, we think of like the entire country or something, but cultures can actually be a lot smaller than that. So, for example, even when we looked at the male versus female in introductory psychology class, we saw that there's quite a bit of a different norm. Well, that's because there are norms for the subculture male and different norms for the subculture female. When we talk about genders specifically, we should actually, instead of saying male and female, we should say man or woman, which are the cultural representations of the sex male or the sex female, right? These can be quite different depending even on the circumstance that you happen to be in. You probably have different norms in your bedroom compared to in a classroom. You act quite differently going clubbing than you do going to church, right? So there are different norms which guide the thoughts and behaviors of what is or isn't appropriate. When we're thinking about this, I want you to think about what are some norms that have affected you and your family. So answer this question for me. Do you or one of your parents come from a country other than the United States? When we asked this question at the University of Maryland, we got almost a 50-50 split. That is that almost 50% of the students in an introductory psychology class uh, had parents from a country other themselves, or their parents came from a country other than the United States. And you can probably guess that there are quite a few differences in what is a culturally accepted norm from one place to another. One common norm that we think that happens in the United States that drives many other countries, well, at least makes them very frustrated, is a tipping norm. So, for example, when you go to a restaurant in the United States, you tip 10, 15, 20% of the bill, whereas in other countries that's just not done. And so to do that behavior seems very, very strange to somebody who's not from this particular tipping culture. The last theoretical perspective is the social cognitive theory. In the social cognitive theory, thoughts and behaviors are guided by cognitions. Now, we need to understand something about the social cognitive theory. The social cognitive theory kind of came as a counter to the behaviorism, which is the learning theory that we talked about before. Remember how the strict behaviorists thought that we didn't think? Remember that? And then we learned that certain species, including our own, can learn by observation. Well, that led us to realize that, hey, maybe our cognitions, maybe our thoughts really are important. So the social cognitive perspective is saying that our thoughts and behaviors are determined by other cognitions. What you see is a list here of other forms of cognitions. Now, this isn't all the forms of cognitions that are out there, but these are good examples of different cognitions that can affect your behaviors. So, for example, beliefs. Anything that you consider to be a fact is a belief. That's a cognition. So, for example, Uggs are in fashion would be a cognition. An attitude is an evaluation of an object. I like Uggs. All right? Your expectations are also cognitions. Hey, I think that if I do this, I'm going to get that. Goals are a form of cognition. Your memories are a form of cognition. So when you think about why would I wear Uggs, anything according to social cognitive theory, you should think of it like a choose your own adventure story, right? You plan it out. You think about, hey, I think that, number one, Uggs are comfy. Number two, I think that Uggs are cute. Number three, I think that if I wear Uggs, I will be able to not be ridiculed by other people. And so number four, therefore, I plan on wearing my Uggs. Now let's talk about the difference between the social cognitive theory and the sociocultural theory. In the sociocultural theory, you just do things because that's the norm, right? Why do you wear Uggs? Oh, because that's what people do, right? Whereas in the social cognitive theory, it's more about your thoughts and beliefs and your plan as to what you're going to do. My goal is to be attractive and not freeze my toes and so when I look in my closet, I see that I can either wear my Birkenstocks or my Uggs, and I choose to wear my Uggs. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about social cognitive. It's that process of letting your thoughts and in other cognitions guide how you are going to act in order to achieve a specific goal. All right, now that we've talked about the 4 theoretical perspectives, let's do a little quiz. The American Psychological Association, also called the APA, describes psychology in 3 words. The A of the ABCs of psychology is affect, and that relates to the study of feelings. So, affect is feelings. So, whenever you see the ABCs of psychology, A stands for feelings. I know that sounds weird, but A stands for affect, and affect means feeling states. Behavior is determined by experience with positive or negative consequences that result. So which of the 4 theories that we looked at would say that behavior is determined by experience with positive or negative consequences that result? That is the learning theory. Learning theory says basically you kind of just act relatively randomly, and whatever brings a positive result, you do it again. Negative consequence, you don't do that anymore. A student downloads Tinder because that's what everyone in her dorm is doing. This would be best explained by which one of these theories? This would be a sociocultural explanation for why you would do that, because everyone is doing it. It is the norm. You do things because that's what your culture does, and that would be a sociocultural theory. Behavior is a function of your knowledge, attitudes, and motives. This is best explained by which one of these theories? This is the social cognitive theory. You do things because of cognitions, knowledge, attitudes, motivations. These are all cognitions. So choose your own adventure, right? But these are cognitions that influence what you plan to do. All right, everybody. Thanks.